Hello there. Really glad you're here for this one, because this is probably the video I spent the most time on out of everything I've made on this channel. And I don't say that to hype it up. I say it because I want you to understand the spirit of what you're about to watch. About 8 months ago I was visiting a reconstructed medieval village. One of those open-air museum setups where they rebuild the houses and the workshops exactly as they would have looked in the 13th or 14th century. And I was standing in the doorway of a peasant cottage, listening to a guy explain the layout. Single room, earthen floor, central fire pit, no chimney, just a hole in the thatch for the smoke. And I remember thinking, almost without meaning to, how long would I last here? Not in a fantasy way. Not in a wouldn't it be fun to be a knight way. In a practical, biological, what would actually kill me way. I went home and started pulling books. Then academic papers. Then I found myself 3 hours deep into 14th century English coroner's rolls. At 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Which is probably the most specific sentence I've ever said out loud. But here we are. And the more I read, the more I realized that almost everything I assumed about what made medieval Europe dangerous was wrong. Or at least, incomplete in a way that completely changes the picture. I knew about the plague, obviously. Everyone knows about the plague. I knew about the wars, the feudalism, the brutality in broad strokes. But the thing that actually would have killed me, the thing that was killing people every single day, quietly, invisibly, was something I had never really thought about. And once I understood it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That's what this documentary is about. It's not a horror show. It's not designed to make you feel lucky in some cheap way. It is a genuine attempt to understand what it was like to be a human body. Just an ordinary, average human body, inside a world that had absolutely no idea what was killing it. Everything in here comes from verifiable historical sources. Primary documents where they exist. Peer-reviewed scholarship. Archaeological evidence from skeletal analysis. Where historians disagree or records are unclear, I'll say so. I'm not going to smooth over the uncertainty to make a cleaner story. The real story is already extraordinary enough. One thing I want to say before we start. This documentary is not designed to make medieval people look primitive or foolish. They were not less intelligent than us. Not less empathetic. Not less human. They were dealing with a biological reality that was genuinely invisible to them, and they handled it with extraordinary resilience. The reason their survival odds were so bad is not a character flaw. It is the absence of specific knowledge that didn't exist anywhere in the world yet. That idea, what it means to not know what you don't know, is the thread that runs through this entire documentary. And by the end, I think you'll feel it somewhere personal. All right. Let's go. You smell it before you see anything. Not metaphorically. Not as a figure of speech. If you were dropped into a medieval European market town right now, today, the smell alone would stop you cold. Animal dung from horses, pigs, cattle, and goats, all of it sitting on unpaved streets. Human waste dumped from upper windows every morning, sometimes with a shouted warning, often without. The tanning district, where raw animal hides were soaked in vats of dog feces mixed with water to soften the leather. The smell of rot, of open slaughter yards, of fish gutted in alleys still slick with last week's blood. And here's the thing, the people living there couldn't smell it anymore. They were adapted to it. You would never adapt, because you'd be dead before you had the chance. This video is going to tell you exactly why. Here is the promise I'm making you right now, within the first 90 seconds. By the time this documentary ends, you won't just understand that medieval Europe was dangerous. You'll understand something deeper, something most people never hear. You'll understand that medieval European society wasn't simply failing to keep people alive. It was structured, at every level, in ways that made survival the exception rather than the rule, and that those structures weren't accidents. They were choices. Some made by kings and lords. Some made by circumstance. Some made by a world that hadn't yet discovered what was killing it. I'm going to show you what it was like to be a body, just a human body, inside that system. Not a knight. Not a nobleman. Not a bishop. The average person. The person whose story almost nobody tells. Let's put you somewhere specific. England. 1320. You've arrived in a small agricultural village, maybe 40 households. You are an adult, let's say 25 years old, which means you've already beaten the hardest odds. In this time and place, somewhere between 30 and 40% of all children born will die before their 5th birthday. You made it. But that doesn't mean much yet. Your house is a single room. Earthen floor. Thatched roof. A fire burning in a central pit with no chimney, just a hole in the thatch. Everything you own smells of wood smoke permanently. Your eyes are probably inflamed from a lifetime of smoke exposure. Your lungs carry soot the way modern lungs carry exhaust. And this is the version where the harvest was adequate. We're going to talk about years when it wasn't. Before we go any further, I want to show you something on that table. That bread. Dark rye. Heavy. Dense. This is what you eat, most days, most meals, for most of your life. Bread and pottage, a thin soup of water, grains, and whatever scraps are available. Most people watching this would look at that bread and think, fine, carbs, I could do worse. Here's what I want you to hold on to. There's something in that bread, something invisible, something that medieval people had absolutely no knowledge of, that was slowly poisoning entire villages at a time. Not occasionally. Regularly. The symptoms were so strange and so terrifying that people believed they were witnessing the work of the devil. I'll tell you exactly what it was and exactly what it did to people. But not yet. One more thing before we move forward. I want to give you a number. Just hold on to it. Don't let it go. Historians studying homicide records from 13th century Oxford, actual coroner's rolls, real documents, calculated a murder rate of approximately 20 per 100,000 people per year. The modern murder rate in England is just under 1 per 100,000. That means you are roughly 20 times more likely to be killed by another person in medieval Oxford than in modern London. And Oxford wasn't even considered particularly dangerous. Some estimates for rural 14th century England put the rate higher. 20 times. I'll come back to that number later in this documentary. When I do, I want you to remember the way it feels right now, sitting in safety, hearing it for the first time. To understand why you can't survive, you first need to understand the cage you're inside. Medieval European society operated on a system called feudalism. The king owned everything, all land, all resources, in theory. He gave parcels of land to lords and barons in exchange for military service. Those lords gave portions to lesser knights in exchange for loyalty and service. And at the absolute bottom of this pyramid, scratching their existence from the soil, were the serfs and villains. That's you. That's almost everyone. Here's what being at the bottom actually meant in concrete, daily terms. You did not own the land you farm. You could not leave your village without your lord's permission. You owed your lord a fixed number of days of labor every week, called week work, often 2 or 3 days out of every 7, farming his land for free. During harvest season, that obligation could jump dramatically. You paid fees to use the mill to grind your grain. You paid fees to use the oven to bake your bread. You paid a death tax, called a heriot, when your father died, typically surrendering your best animal to the Lord. This wasn't occasional. This wasn't temporary. This was every day. Every year. Every generation. I want you to understand what this actually cost a human body. The agricultural work of a medieval peasant was relentless in ways that are genuinely difficult to comprehend. Historians estimate the average medieval peasant performed physical labor equivalent to around 12 miles of walking per day, but with the added strain of digging, lifting, plowing, and harvesting with hand tools. From roughly the age of 6 or 7, children worked. There was no separation between childhood and labor. You worked as soon as you were physically capable. And you were doing this on a diet that was, in many seasons, not enough. Grain, primarily wheat or rye for bread, barley for ale, made up sometimes 80% of your caloric intake. Meat, unless you were lucky enough to own an animal or skilled enough to poach from the Lord's forest, was a luxury you tasted perhaps a few times per year. Poaching, by the way, carried brutal punishment. Forest laws in medieval England protected the king's deer and game fiercely. Penalties ranged from mutilation, the removal of a hand or eye, to death. Now here's the thing that changes everything you've just heard. You could survive the exhaustion, potentially. You could survive the thin diet, if the harvest cooperated. What you almost certainly could not survive was the water. Medieval towns and villages lacked any concept of separating drinking water sources from waste disposal, not because people were stupid, but because they had no knowledge of germ theory, no microscopes, no framework to connect the privy upstream to the fever downstream. In London by the 13th and 14th centuries, the Thames was essentially an open sewer. Human waste, animal carcasses, industrial runoff from tanneries and dye works. The wells inside the city drew from ground that was saturated with the overflow from tens of thousands of cesspits. Dysentery, called the bloody flux in medieval documents, moved through medieval populations constantly. It was so common that many people considered it a normal feature of life, not a disease. It killed a staggering number of people in a particularly slow and miserable way. And it was in the water. Everywhere. Here's the reframe that should stop you cold. We've been told for generations that the medieval period was defined by war. Battles. Crusades. Sieges. And yes, war happened. War was brutal. War killed people. But war was not the primary killer of medieval Europeans. Not even close. For the vast majority of people, the 90% who were not knights, not soldiers, not fighting any battle, the killers were invisible. They were in the water you drank. They were in the grain you ate. They were in the air of the windowless room where you slept next to your animals for warmth. They were in the body of a child sleeping next to you who had been coughing for a week. War got the chronicles. War got the monuments. The invisible killers got the mass graves. And one of them, the most devastating of all, was coming. In about 27 years from where we've set our scene, 1320, something would arrive from Central Asia that would kill between 30 and 60% of every living person in Europe. But before we get there, I need to tell you how fragile you already were before it arrived. If I asked 100 people right now what would kill them in medieval Europe, I'd hear the same answers. The plague. The wars. The poverty. A sword through the chest. A siege. The Inquisition. All of those things are real. All of those things killed people. But none of them would be what got you. The thing most likely to end your life, the thing that killed more medieval Europeans than any single war, any single battle, and arguably more than the Black Death itself across the full breadth of the medieval period, was a combination you've probably never considered. Infection from contamination you didn't know existed, working on a body already weakened by nutritional deficiency you couldn't diagnose, in a medical system that frequently made things worse rather than better. That's the real killer. not the knight on the battlefield. The invisible biology that owned your body before you were even born. Let me make this concrete. You're working in a field in medieval England. A poorly maintained scythe slips. You have a cut, 3 inches long, on your lower forearm. Not deep. Not life-threatening by modern standards. You would go to a hospital, get stitches, a tetanus shot, maybe antibiotics, and you'd be back at work in a week. In medieval England, you do none of those things. You may wrap it in a strip of cloth, probably not clean. You may apply a poultice of herbs. Some herbs had genuine antimicrobial properties. Some did nothing. Some actively introduced more bacteria. And then you go back to work, in the same field, kneeling in the same soil. There was no concept of sterile wound care. Not because medieval people were careless, but because nobody, anywhere in the world, had yet discovered that invisible organisms caused infection. Germ theory wouldn't arrive until Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the 1860s and 1880s. You were 500 years from that knowledge. The cut gets red, then swollen, then hot. The infection spreads. Without antibiotics, without any mechanism to stop what's happening inside your body, sepsis is a real possibility. People died from small cuts and minor injuries routinely throughout the medieval period. Records from medieval English coroners' rolls confirm it repeatedly. Now compound that vulnerability with what your diet was doing to your immune system. Vitamin C deficiency, scurvy, was endemic in medieval Europe, particularly in winter and early spring, when fresh vegetables and fruit completely disappeared from most diets. Scurvy doesn't just make your gums bleed. It breaks down collagen throughout your entire body. Old wounds reopen. Joints swell. Your teeth loosen and fall out. Your immune system, already working against constant bacterial exposure, crumbles further. Vitamin D deficiency, from limited sun exposure in northern Europe's grey winters, combined with a diet low in fish and fortified foods, caused widespread rickets in children and contributed to a bone brittleness in adults that made ordinary farm injuries far more serious. Vitamin A deficiency caused night blindness. And in a world with no artificial light, where you navigated by firelight or moonlight, being unable to see clearly after sunset had serious and sometimes fatal consequences. Here's what I want you to understand: you weren't just poor and working hard. You were immunocompromised from birth, by a diet that couldn't fully sustain human health, living in an environment saturated with pathogens, treated by a medical system that, with some genuine exceptions we'll come to, largely didn't understand what was happening to you. I told you earlier there was one group of people in medieval society who actually had meaningfully better survival odds than almost everyone else. You probably assumed I meant the nobility. The wealthy. The people with warm castles and stored food. I'm going to tell you who it actually was. But not yet. What I need you to understand first is why the system was so hard to escape, not just physically, but psychologically. If you were born into a village in 1295 and you lived to 35, you would have seen children die. You would have seen neighbors die from infections you had no name for. You would have buried siblings. And you would have understood this as simply the nature of life. Not injustice. Not a failure of your society. Just life. The most insidious thing about the medieval medical reality wasn't the suffering. It was the normalization. When you don't know anything different is possible, you can't miss it. And for the entire medieval period, roughly 1,000 years, almost no one in Europe had reason to believe anything fundamentally different was possible. Until one event forced an entire civilization to ask questions it had never thought to ask before. And that event was still coming. You probably know that medieval people drank ale instead of water, and you probably think you know why. The common explanation is that ale was safer than water because the brewing process killed pathogens. This is partially true. Boiling water to make ale did kill some waterborne bacteria. But here's what the romanticized version leaves out. Medieval ale was weak by modern standards, roughly 2 to 4% alcohol. It was not a recreational drink. It was closer to a grain porridge that had been made into a liquid. Children drank it. It was consumed with breakfast. And it spoiled quickly without refrigeration. Ale brewed with contaminated water, or stored in unwashed barrels, could and did carry the same pathogens that made well water dangerous. The protection was imperfect at best. But here's the larger point. The ale tells you something about what medieval people were eating and drinking every single day. Almost nothing in a medieval peasant's diet had been processed, stored, or prepared in ways that reliably prevented contamination. No pasteurization. No refrigeration. No canning. No sealed packaging. Every meal was a direct encounter with the microbial world. And then there's the lead. This part consistently surprises people. Medieval pottery was often glazed with a lead compound that gave the vessels their characteristic shine. Medieval wine, particularly on the continent, was sometimes stored in or processed through lead vessels. Lead pipes, inherited from Roman infrastructure that persisted into the medieval period in some areas, carried water in certain wealthier households. Here's what low-level, chronic lead poisoning does to a human body. It accumulates in bones and soft tissue over years. It damages the nervous system gradually, causing fatigue, confusion, irritability, weakness. It harms kidney function. In pregnant women, it dramatically increases the risk of miscarriage and stillbirth. In children, even small amounts impair cognitive development. This was not theoretical. Modern analysis of skeletal remains from medieval European burial sites has found elevated lead concentrations, particularly in higher status individuals who had access to more pewter and lead-glazed fine pottery. The wealthier you were, in some respects, the more lead you were ingesting. Medieval social hierarchy, if you follow it carefully enough, managed to make privilege quietly toxic. I want to talk about women specifically for a moment, because the calculus of survival was different for them in one very specific and very stark way. Childbirth. Historical demographers studying medieval English records estimate maternal mortality at roughly 1 to 2% per birth. That sounds small. It isn't. The average number of pregnancies for a medieval peasant woman who survived to adulthood was somewhere between 5 and 8. At 1% mortality per birth, across 5 births, your cumulative lifetime risk of dying in childbirth approaches 5%. At 2%, it climbs toward 10%. And these numbers, already sobering, likely undercount the deaths from related complications, infections following delivery, hemorrhage days later, conditions that weren't recorded as birth-related but clearly were. There was no effective pain management. No surgical intervention for obstructed labor that could reliably save both mother and child. A skilled midwife could make an enormous difference, and medieval midwives had genuine accumulated knowledge. But there are cases they simply could not manage. And in those cases, the outcome was final. For a medieval woman, surviving to adulthood meant entering a cycle of physical risk that had no equivalent for men. Everything I've just described, the contaminated water, the nutritional deficiency, the wound infections, the lead, the childbirth mortality, is the baseline. The floor. This is life when nothing catastrophic is happening. And then, starting in the spring of 1315, something catastrophic happened. It rained. Not occasionally. Not in episodes. It rained throughout the spring planting season of 1315 with an intensity and persistence that destroyed crops across northern Europe. It rained through the summer. It rained through the autumn. The harvest of 1315 was catastrophic. And then it happened again in 1316. And 1317. And with variations and partial recoveries, the agricultural collapse continued for roughly 7 years. This is known to historians as the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. Estimates of mortality vary, but scholars have suggested that somewhere between 10 and 25% of the population of Northern Europe died, from starvation, from the diseases that follow starvation, from the social breakdown that follows mass death. In some urban areas, mortality was higher. People ate dogs, cats, horses. Records from the period describe families abandoning children they could not feed. At least one chronicle from the period, written by a monk in the Low Countries, describes cannibalism, though historians treat such accounts carefully. When you factor in the Great Famine, the picture of medieval survival stops being merely grim. It becomes something else entirely. And the plague hadn't even arrived yet. Remember the bread? I told you at the very beginning of this documentary that there was something invisible in that bread, something medieval people had no name for, that was poisoning entire villages. Here's what it was. A fungus called Claviceps purpurea grows on rye crops, particularly in wet, cold conditions. It produces structures called ergots, dark, elongated bodies that replace the rye grain and are almost indistinguishable from ordinary grain to the naked eye. When those ergots are ground into flour and baked into bread and eaten, they release alkaloids into the human body that constrict blood vessels, cause vivid hallucinations, and in severe cases, completely cut off circulation to the extremities. The symptoms of ergot poisoning, historically documented throughout the medieval period, included intense burning sensations in the hands and feet, described by sufferers as if their limbs were on fire from the inside. Convulsions. Hallucinations so vivid and terrifying that afflicted communities believed they were being tormented by demons. And in the worst cases, dry gangrene, the limbs would simply begin to die, blacken, and eventually fall off, while the person was still alive. This condition had a name, ignis sacer, holy fire, or, in later centuries, Saint Anthony's fire. Documented outbreaks occurred throughout France, Germany, and the Rhineland during the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. One of the earliest recorded outbreaks, in 994 CE, is estimated by some historians to have killed around 40,000 people in France alone. That number, 40,000, from a fungus in bread that nobody knew existed. I want to introduce you to a man named Agnolo di Tura. He was a Sienese merchant and chronicler, meaning he was one of the literate people of his age who kept written records. His nickname, recorded in his own documents, was the Fat. He lived in Siena, in what is now central Italy. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in Siena. Agnolo di Tura wrote what happened. He described, in his own words, in his own handwriting, on a page that still exists, burying his 5 children with his own hands because there was no one else to do it. 5 children. With his own hands. He wrote that the people who died were so numerous that pits were dug and the dead were laid in, covered with a little earth, and then more dead were laid on top of them. He wrote that dogs dragged bodies from the shallow graves. Here is someone who recorded, as precisely as he could, what was happening around him. Not a statistic. A father. A man with a nickname. A man who lost everything and kept writing because writing was the only response he had. When we talk about the Black Death, we talk about percentages of population. Agnolo di Tura tells us what percentages actually felt like. Let me walk you through what a medieval death from a common illness actually looked like. Not the plague. Not war. Something ordinary. A bad case of dysentery in a village in rural England, 1310. You wake up with stomach cramps. By midday, the cramping has become severe, accompanied by diarrhea with blood. You are exhausted. You can't keep any food down. There is no rehydration therapy. No for fluids. No oral rehydration salts. By day 2, you are significantly dehydrated. Your heart rate has increased to compensate for falling blood pressure. You are weak enough that you cannot stand for long. A family member brings you water drawn from the same source that may have caused this in the first place. By day 4, if you're young and otherwise healthy, your immune system may be fighting back. Or you may be entering the phase where dehydration and secondary infection create a downward spiral your body cannot recover from. There is no moment where a doctor arrives with the right answer. There is a wise woman in the village who knows which herbs reduce cramping. Some of them genuinely help. Some of them do nothing. None of them address the pathogen. Medieval physicians, educated men who had studied at universities like Bologna, Paris, or Oxford, were trained primarily in humoral theory, the idea that illness resulted from imbalances of 4 bodily fluids. Their treatments included bloodletting, purging, and dietary adjustments. In the case of dysentery, bloodletting actively accelerated dehydration. The physician was making you worse. Not out of malice. Out of genuine conviction in the best medical framework available to them. And that is somehow the most heartbreaking part of the whole story. I'll be honest with you, this is the part that's hardest to sit with. Medieval parents knew their children were likely to die. Not in an abstract way. In a statistical, experienced, unavoidable way. Historians have debated for decades whether this reality caused medieval parents to emotionally distance themselves from infants, to withhold attachment because the grief of loss was too likely. The evidence, actually, suggests the opposite. Medieval cemetery records and documentary sources show that children were buried with toys, with care, with evident mourning. Parents grieved. They grieved and then had more children, because children were the only form of economic security and old age care that existed. And those children died at roughly 30 to 40% rates before age 5. And parents buried them. And had more. For 1,000 years. The emotional weight of that cycle, that unending, unrelenting cycle of birth and early death, sits underneath every other fact in this documentary. It's the context for everything. Before we go any further, I need you to hold that. Because what comes next is the moment when even that normalized grief became something medieval people had no framework for. Okay. Just me for a second. I always debate whether to do one of these midpoints in a documentary this long. The instinct is to just let the material keep breathing. But after that last chapter, after Agnolo di Tura, I think it's worth pausing. 5 children. His own hands. A nickname recorded in his own documents, the Fat. Just a regular person with a nickname who lost everything and kept writing. That detail is the reason I make these videos. Not the statistics. Not the timelines. That one specific man, in that one specific city, in that one year. And I want to say something clearly at the halfway point. Nothing in this documentary is designed to make medieval people look small. The people we're talking about were not simpler than us. They were not less. They were brilliant, resilient, creative, loving people dealing with a physical reality that was completely invisible to them. The tragedy isn't their failure. The tragedy is that the knowledge that could have saved them didn't exist yet. I keep coming back to that, because I think it matters for the second half of this documentary in ways that will become clearer when we get to chapter 10. We're halfway. The Black Death is coming. And after that, something nobody talks about clearly enough. Let's keep going. I told you in chapter 2 that there was a document, a type of document, that changes how we understand medieval medicine. Here it is. The Medieval Herbal. These were comprehensive illustrated manuscripts cataloging plants and their medicinal properties, compiled by monks, physicians, and learned women across the medieval period. The most influential was the herbarium of Pseudo-Apuleius, copied and expanded throughout the early medieval period, supplemented by works from Islamic scholars like Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, whose medical encyclopedia was translated into Latin and used in European universities for centuries. Here's what's surprising. Modern pharmacological analysis of plants documented in medieval herbals has confirmed genuine therapeutic activity in a significant number of them. Willow bark, a standard medieval treatment for fever and pain, contains salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid, the active compound in aspirin. Garlic, used extensively in medieval medicine as an antimicrobial, has documented antibacterial properties. Honey, applied to wounds in medieval practice, creates an osmotic environment that inhibits bacterial growth, a property modern wound care has rediscovered. Valerian root, used in medieval medicine for anxiety and sleeplessness, has compounds with genuine mild sedative effects. Medieval medicine was not purely superstition. Mixed into the bloodletting and the humoral theory and the astrology, there was something real. These practitioners were observing the world carefully. They simply lacked the theoretical framework to understand why certain things worked. Medieval surgery also deserves more credit than it usually receives. Henri de Mondeville, a French surgeon who lived from approximately 1260 to 1320, contemporaneous with our 1320 English village, wrote a major surgical text arguing explicitly against unnecessary wound irrigation with wine, against the deliberate promotion of wound suppuration, and in favor of keeping wounds clean and closed. His thinking was ahead of the dominant medical consensus of his age. He was, in some respects, arguing for principles that wouldn't become standard surgical practice for another 500 years. Medieval surgeons performed cataract operations, using a technique called couching, which involved displacing the clouded lens from the visual axis. It wasn't perfect. Many patients lost vision anyway. But it was surgery on a living human eye, with no anesthesia beyond crude herbal preparations, with some genuine success rate. Medieval surgeons amputated limbs. They trepanned skulls, drilling holes in the cranium to relieve pressure from head injuries. Skulls recovered from medieval burial sites show evidence of trepanation with healed bone, meaning the patient survived the procedure. The gap between medieval medicine and nothing is smaller than popular culture suggests. The gap between medieval medicine and what you would need to survive a serious illness or injury is still enormous. But I wanted you to understand, the people living inside this system were not helpless. Some of them were brilliant. They just didn't have the tools. Now here's the uncomfortable truth that lives inside this counter-narrative. Some of the harm done by medieval medicine was not from ignorance of the natural world. It was from a specific combination of theology and medical theory that created a framework in which suffering could be meaningful, and in which interventions that caused pain were sometimes preferred over those that didn't. Bloodletting, almost universally harmful in the way it was practiced, persisted for centuries partly because bleeding was conceptually satisfying within humoral theory, and partly because a treatment that visibly did something felt more powerful than an herb that merely soothed. When the Black Death arrived and the medical establishment had no answer, when every treatment failed and people continued to die in extraordinary numbers, the response of significant portions of medieval society was to escalate the suffering voluntarily. The flagellant movement swept through Germany and the Low Countries in 1349. Groups of men, sometimes hundreds at a time, marched from town to town, publicly whipping themselves with leather scourges embedded with metal studs, called a flagram. They believed they were performing penance, that the plague was God's punishment for sin, and that physical suffering was the only possible appeasement. Some of those processions moved through multiple towns, carrying, through the very physical acts of communal gathering, whatever was actually killing people. I'll be honest, I find this hard to think about. People convinced that their suffering was redemptive, who marched themselves into danger believing they were being saved, and who helped spread the very thing they were trying to appease. The tragedy of medieval Europe isn't just death. It's the architecture of belief that surrounded death. And that architecture, in some circumstances, made things measurably worse. Let's come back to that murder rate number. 20 per 100,000. I asked you to hold on to it. Here's what that number actually means in daily life. In our 1320 English village of 40 households, let's say 200 people, that murder rate suggests that statistically, someone in that village is killed by another person roughly every 2.5 years. Not in a war. Not by soldiers. By a neighbor. A family member. Someone in a dispute over land, or livestock, or an insult that couldn't be walked away from. Medieval English court records, called coroner's rolls, document the specific, granular texture of this violence. Killings over debts. Over women. Over perceived dishonor. Killings with agricultural tools, with knives worn on the belt as standard everyday items. Killings in taverns. Killings on roads. The legal system existed, but its reach was limited, its enforcement uneven, and its punishment severe to the point that many victims' families chose not to report crimes rather than trigger a legal process that might consume them. And underneath all of this violence was the same economic pressure that structured everything else. People with nothing to lose, with no way to legally resolve disputes, with weapons on their belts as a matter of daily survival, living in close quarters in conditions of chronic stress. Violence isn't random in medieval society. It's a symptom of the same structural choices that made clean water impossible and good nutrition rare. October 1347. 12 Genoese trading vessels dock in the harbor of Messina, Sicily. The port authorities who board those ships make a discovery that, in the records of the time, is described with a kind of horrified understatement. Most of the crew are dead. Those still alive are covered in black, oozing swellings, in the groin, in the armpits, on the neck, some the size of an egg. They are bleeding from the skin, from the mouth, from orifices that should not bleed. They are delirious. The Sicilian authorities make the correct call. They order the ships out of the harbor immediately. But it was already too late. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on rats, had already reached the shore. And from that harbor, it would move across the entirety of Europe with a speed and completeness that had never been seen before and has never been equaled since. Within 4 years, the Black Death would kill somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. In a continent with a total population of approximately 75 million. Let me say that again with the translation it deserves. If 1 in 3 people in your country, or 1 in 2 people in your country, died within 4 years, what would be left? The Black Death didn't creep across Europe. It moved like fire. It reached the Italian mainland by late 1347. It reached southern France and Spain by early 1348. Paris fell by the summer of 1348. England was hit by the summer of 1348 as well. Scandinavia by 1349. The remote regions of Eastern Europe by 1351. In some of the hardest hit cities, the mortality was staggering. Florence lost perhaps half its population. Contemporary accounts describe bodies stacked in streets because the normal mechanisms of burial could not keep pace. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the Black Death in Florence and wrote the Decameron in its immediate aftermath, described neighbors who refused to enter the houses of the sick, parents who abandoned children, children who abandoned parents. He described oxen wandering city streets without handlers, pigs rooting through houses that had been emptied by death. The social fabric, already fragile, disintegrated in many places entirely. But here's the part that historians argue about most intensely, and the part that should trouble you most. The Black Death didn't come from nowhere. Medieval trade routes, the very infrastructure that connected European civilization and drove its prosperity, were the highways along which the plague traveled. Every connection that made medieval Europe richer and more complex was also a connection through which death could move faster and further than it had ever moved before. Progress and catastrophe, in medieval Europe, were not opposites. They were the same road. As the Black Death killed with indiscriminate fury, medieval society searched desperately for an explanation. Miasma, bad air from rotting matter, was the dominant medical theory. Some physicians attributed the plague to a malign conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345. And in dozens of cities across the Holy Roman Empire and the Rhineland, the answer that gained deadly traction was this: the Jews had poisoned the wells. It was a lie. A fabrication with no evidence whatsoever, which any observer could have disproven simply by noting that Jewish communities died of the plague at similar rates to Christian ones. But in the grip of mass death and mass terror, evidence was not the currency in circulation. Between 1348 and 1351, Jewish communities were massacred across what is now Germany, Switzerland, and France. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, an estimated 2,000 Jewish people were burned alive, some accounts say in a cemetery, on a platform of wood, before the plague had even reached the city. They were killed in anticipation of a catastrophe that hadn't arrived yet. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull, Quamvis Perfidium, in 1348, explicitly stating that Jews were not responsible for the plague and condemning the massacres. It was largely ignored. When I said earlier that medieval violence was a symptom of structural conditions, this is what I meant at its most extreme. A civilization under existential pressure, without scientific frameworks, without effective institutions of protection, found the most vulnerable nearby group. And did what terrified, leaderless populations have done throughout history. I'm going to make the present-day mirror explicit. You know this pattern. You have seen it in your lifetime. The specifics change. The shape does not. By 1351, the acute phase of the first wave of the Black Death in Europe was over. But over is a strange word for what had happened. The plague didn't leave. It came back in 1361, and 1369, and 1374. And again across the following century, in waves that, while less catastrophic than the first, kept the population of Europe depressed for more than 100 years. Europe in 1380 had approximately half the population it had in 1340. And here's the question that stopped me cold when I first sat with it. What do you do with half a world? The answer, the thing that actually happened, the transformation that the Black Death forced on medieval civilization, is the part of this story that nobody tells clearly. Because it's not a story of recovery. It's a story of something collapsing. And something else, something unexpected, beginning to emerge from the wreckage. That's next. Remember the group I told you about in Chapter 3? The one with meaningfully better odds than almost everyone else. Not the nobles. Not the wealthy merchants. It was the monks. Specifically, monks living in established, well-resourced monasteries in the 12th and 13th centuries, before the Black Death fundamentally disrupted monastic populations. Here's why their survival odds were better. Monasteries followed the rule of Saint Benedict, which included regular, structured meals. Not lavish, fasting was a frequent religious obligation, but consistent. Regular caloric intake, with some variation through the liturgical calendar, meant monastic populations were significantly less likely to suffer the acute nutritional crashes that made peasant populations so vulnerable to secondary infections. Many monasteries maintained herb gardens specifically for medical purposes. A skilled monastic infirmera, the monk responsible for medical care, had access to the accumulated herbal knowledge of centuries. Not perfect, but better than nothing. Monasteries also maintained their own water sources, wells dug specifically, cisterns managed and maintained, that were often cleaner than the shared water sources of nearby towns. And here's the final factor: literacy. Monks could read. They could access, copy, and transmit medical knowledge. They could read Avicenna, Galen, the Iberian. They could make informed decisions about treatment rather than relying solely on tradition and hope. The monastery, inside the violent and contaminated world of medieval Europe, was something close to a functioning public health system. For the monks inside it. Nobody else. Now here's the turn that changes everything you think you know about the Black Death's legacy. With 30 to 50% of Europe's population dead, something happened to the survivors that had never happened before in the history of medieval European society. Labor became scarce. For the first time in living memory, for the first time in centuries, there were more farms than farmers, more livestock than handlers, more land than people to work it. And for the first time in the history of European serfdom, peasants had leverage. Lords who had previously been able to set wages and working conditions unilaterally, because peasants had nowhere to go and no power to refuse, suddenly found themselves competing for workers. Peasants began leaving manors for better conditions on neighboring estates. Wages for agricultural labor rose sharply across England and France in the decades immediately following the Black Death. The English Parliament, alarmed, passed the Statute of Laboris in 1351, attempting to legally freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent labourers from leaving their home manors. It didn't work. The economic pressure was too great. And the resentment that built around that failed attempt at suppression helped fuel the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The revolt was suppressed. But the feudal system, already cracked, never fully recovered its pre-plague form. The Black Death killed a third of Europe. And paradoxically, in some measurable economic ways, made the survivors wealthier than their grandparents had been. I don't know how to resolve that. I'm not sure it can be resolved. Something else shifted after the Black Death. Something harder to measure than wages or mortality rates. Medieval art, after 1350, changed. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became a dominant artistic motif across Europe. Images of skeletal death leading figures of every social rank, pope, emperor, knight, peasant, physician, in a final procession. Death who does not discriminate. Death who takes the king as readily as the beggar. This was new. Pre-plague medieval art is full of hierarchy, heaven arranged in ranks, saints in proper order, the social structure mirrored in the divine. Post-plague medieval art is haunted by a different kind of equality. The equality of the grave. Philosophers and historians have argued that this shift in visual and intellectual culture, this confrontation with mortality as the great equalizer, contributed to the intellectual ferment that eventually became the Renaissance and the Reformation. The plague forced a reckoning with suffering that the existing theological and philosophical frameworks could not fully absorb. And the question of why a just God had allowed this specific, total, indiscriminate devastation opened cracks in the intellectual foundations of medieval Catholicism that grew wider over the following century. Entire civilizational trajectories changed because of dead fleas on dead rats in the hold of Geno's trading ships. Specificity, in history, is everything. Here's what I want you to sit with before we look at the aftermath. Everything I've described, the contaminated water, the nutritional deficiency, the ergot in the rye, the violence, the childbirth mortality, the plague, none of it was mysterious to the people living through it. It was simply life. The conditions were not a puzzle to be solved. They were a landscape to be inhabited. And the people who inhabited that landscape were not passive or helpless. They built elaborate social structures, stunning cathedrals, universities, legal systems, trade networks, philosophical traditions. They composed music. They painted in gold. They loved their children and buried them. The failure wasn't human. The failure was the absence of specific knowledge, specific, technical, empirical knowledge, that didn't exist anywhere in the world yet. The knowledge that bacteria caused infection. The knowledge that clean water was a medical necessity. The knowledge that nutrition was medicine. That knowledge existed nowhere. And when it finally began to arrive, not until the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the change in human survival was so dramatic that historians call it one of the most significant transitions in human history. We'll talk about what that transition means right now. I made you a promise in Chapter 1. I said I was going to give you a number near the end of this documentary. Here it is. If you were born in medieval England in 1300, not during a famine year, not during a plague year, an ordinary year, your probability of reaching your 5th birthday was approximately 60 to 70%. Your probability of reaching your 20th birthday was roughly 50%. Your probability of reaching your 50th birthday was, for most people, under 30%. Now here's the number for contrast. If you were born in England today, your probability of reaching your 5th birthday is approximately 99.5%. Your probability of reaching your 50th birthday is over 90%. The gap between those two sets of numbers represents the entirety of what this documentary has been about. It is not primarily a gap in wealth. It is a gap in knowledge. Knowledge of germ theory. Knowledge of nutrition. Knowledge of sanitation. Knowledge of vaccines, of antibiotics, of sterile surgical technique. Every child alive today who reaches their 5th birthday is the direct beneficiary of approximately 500 years of accumulated empirical science. Not just medicine. The plumbing. The sewers. The refrigeration. The pasteurized milk. The food safety regulations that prevent ergot in commercial flour. The clean municipal water systems. We are not tougher than medieval people. We are not stronger or more resilient. We are simply downstream of knowledge they didn't have. Life expectancy at birth in England was roughly 35 to 40 years in the medieval period. It was still roughly 40 years in 1800. By 1900, it had climbed to around 50 years. By 1950, it was 67. Today, it is approximately 81. Look at that curve. 1,000 years of essentially flat survival odds. Then a vertical climb within 150 years. What happened? John Snow, not the fictional one, mapped a cholera outbreak in London in 1854 by tracing cases to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street. He convinced local authorities to remove the pump handle. The outbreak stopped. It was, arguably, the first practical demonstration that a specific contaminated water source caused a specific disease. It changed public health forever. Joseph Lister introduced antiseptic surgical technique in the 1860s using carbolic acid, based on Pasteur's germ theory. Surgical mortality rates fell from roughly 50% in some procedures to near negligible levels within decades. The introduction of municipal sewage systems in major European cities in the second half of the 19th century, the construction that Londoners called the Great Stink because it required openly addressing where their waste was going, produced measurable drops in waterborne disease mortality within years. Everything that medieval people were dying from. Addressed. Systematically. Within roughly 70 years of decisive scientific and engineering action. That is how thin the wall between medieval death rates and modern ones actually is. Here is where I have to stop you for a moment. Because everything I've just described, the clean water, the sewage systems, the germ theory, the antibiotics, these things are not universal. Not even close. The World Health Organization estimates that approximately 2 billion people today do not have access to safe drinking water at home. Roughly 3.6 billion people lack safely managed sanitation services. Diarrheal disease, which killed that fictional English villager I described in Chapter 5, kills approximately 1.5 million children under 5 every year. Not in the medieval period. This year. And every year. The medieval conditions I've described in this documentary do not exist only in the past. They exist in the present, in specific zip codes and specific countries and specific situations of poverty and structural neglect, because the knowledge that could prevent them is not the same as the political will to deploy that knowledge. This is not a political statement. It's a factual one. Every single preventable death from contaminated water or childhood malnutrition in the modern world is a death happening for reasons we fully understand and possess the means to address. Medieval people died because they didn't know. Some people die today because the structures that could protect them have never been built. Those are two very different problems with a very similar body count. I want to end this chapter not with tragedy but with something that genuinely stops me. The cathedrals of medieval Europe, Notre Dame de Paris, Chartres, Cologne, Salisbury, were built by people whose children had a 40% chance of dying before age 5. They were built by people who might lose half their town to an invisible contamination in the water. They were built by people who had no certainty that the food they grew wouldn't be poisoned by a fungus they couldn't see. And they built things intended to last forever. The theological explanation is obvious. They built for God, for eternity, for the souls of the dead. But I think there's something else in it. Something human and irreducible. People under conditions of radical mortality build things that outlast them. The impermanence of the body met the permanence of stone. And 700 years later, we still walk into those spaces and feel something we don't fully have language for. Medieval people did not survive their era, statistically speaking. But they left marks on the world that are still here. Which raises a question I want to hold until the final chapter. Let me tell you what I think you've actually learned in the last 70-something minutes. Not just that medieval Europe was dangerous. Not just that peasants had it harder than we imagine. Something more specific. Something that I think you'll carry differently than you carried the vague cultural understanding of medieval times. You now know that the primary killers of medieval Europeans were not dragons or knights or even the plague, though the plague was catastrophic. They were water. They were food. They were the invisible biology of an unwashed womb. They were the structures that prevented the people at the bottom of the hierarchy from accessing anything better. And you now know that everything standing between you and those same killers is a set of systems, pipes, regulations, institutions, scientific knowledge, that were built within the last century and a half. Built by specific people. Maintained by ongoing collective investment. Not inevitable. Not permanent. Contingent. Here's the thing about systems that keep you alive, you stop noticing them. You turn on the tap and clean water comes out. You have no emotional relationship with the sewage system that takes your waste away safely. You eat bread made from inspected grain with no ergot, and you don't think about ergot. You get a cut, apply antiseptic, and don't think about sepsis. I'm not saying you should spend your life in anxious gratitude. That would be exhausting and probably counterproductive. But I do think there's a cost to complete invisibility. When we stop understanding what systems do, we become vulnerable to arguments that they aren't necessary. We become vulnerable to the idea that the protection is permanent, inevitable, built into reality, rather than built by deliberate human decision-making and maintained by deliberate human investment. Medieval people didn't have what they needed. We have it. The question, and this is not rhetorical, is whether we understand it well enough to protect it. I want to close this documentary with something that I've been sitting with since I started researching it. If you walked the streets of a medieval city in 1320, the smell, the mud, the noise, the faces, you would see people who were, in every meaningful psychological sense, identical to you. They had the same capacity for love, the same cognitive complexity, the same range of emotion, the same will to survive. They were not simpler. They were not less. They were just earlier. They had not yet accumulated the knowledge that would eventually make their grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren safe from the things that killed them. They died from things that were preventable, not because they were careless or foolish, but because the prevention didn't exist. And I've been asking myself, since I started this project, whether the inverse of that might also be true. Whether there are things killing people right now, this year, this decade, that future generations will look back on the way we look back on the medieval water supply. Things we're doing, structures we're maintaining, knowledge gaps we're living inside, that our descendants will find as incomprehensible as we find dying from an infected scratch. I don't know what those things are. If I did, they wouldn't be gaps anymore. But I believe they exist. I believe we are the medieval people of our own future. And the question, the one I can't answer, the one I leave with you, is this: what knowledge do you not have yet that, 300 years from now, will seem as obvious as clean water? What is killing people today that future generations will look back on and ask, how did they not see it? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if this made you see something differently, if any piece of this stuck, please share it. Because the entire reason I make these videos is to hand something across time. Just like they built the cathedrals. Reaching forward, into an uncertain future, hoping something lands. Hey! Even when I've spent months with the material, there's something about reaching the end that lands differently every time. Thank you for staying. Genuinely. A 75-minute documentary on YouTube is a lot to ask of someone. You gave that, and I don't take it lightly. I want to say one more thing about that final question. The one I left you with at the end. I want to be clear, it's not rhetorical. I'm not just fishing for engagement with a clever close-up. I genuinely don't know the answer. That's the point. The most dangerous gaps in human knowledge are never the ones we're aware of. Once you know a gap exists, you can start filling it. The dangerous ones are the gaps you don't know you have. The places where you're operating with confidence inside a framework that is simply wrong in ways you can't see yet. Medieval physicians weren't stupid. They thought humoral theory was correct. They experienced bloodletting as a legitimate, helpful intervention. They were just inside the only framework that existed. We are also inside frameworks. All of us. Right now. I find that genuinely unsettling. I hope you do too. Not in a paralyzing way. In a curious, stay awake, keep asking way. Leave your answer in the comments. I read them. The conversations that happen down there on a video like this are usually more interesting than anything I could have scripted. A few book recommendations if you want to go further. Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror is the foundation for almost everything in this documentary. It is one of the best works of popular history I have ever read, and it will wreck you in the best possible way. John Kelly's The Great Mortality is the definitive popular account of the Black Death. And for the broader picture of medieval life at ground level, you want Francis and Joseph Geese, Life in a Medieval Village. All three are in the description. Subscribe if you haven't. That button matters more than it sounds like it should, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. And take care of yourself. Drink clean water. Which sounds like a joke after everything we just talked about. But I actually mean it. The systems standing between you and a medieval water supply are not permanent. They were built by specific people, with specific political will, at specific moments in history. They require maintenance. They require attention. They require people who understand what they're actually for. Don't take them for granted. I'll see you in the next one.